Okay, I took the liberty upon looking and examining just a few of the presidents, but I wanted to add and extend this list here. And by the way, this is Antoinette 70, and good morning to you. For those who are listening and who are viewing this video, this is entitled The 11 Most Racist U.S. Presidents. But I'd like to say there are other presidents that we're dealing with that also should be added to this list. And I'm sure that you can think of a few. um, so, the 11 most racist U.S. presidents, and this was back in 2016, and so this is a little more. I hope you can view the painting here, and it's a vintage American history print. The 21 presidents of the U.S. and they're seated here. And some of these people you probably know by name, naming them. So it goes on to say that let's imagine the unimaginable. Donald Trump was elected president in November, and yes, president of the U.S. So let's imagine the impossible. He forced Mexico to build a border wall. Let's imagine the unthinkable. He deported millions of Latino and Latinas. And let's imagine the unconscionable. He ruthlessly terrorized Muslim Americans and hashtag Black Lives Matter activists. Let's imagine the unacceptable. Middle and low income people suffered horribly under the weight of this billionaire's policies. So that's to start this article off. Now let's get down to business here. Real life, real news, real voices. Huffington Post, this is where this is coming from. 11 most racist U.S. presidents, including some of the newer ones, some of the ones that we can think of currently or more recently in the years going back. Let's imagine that he did not moderate on his campaign pledges and he carried them out as president. Would a President Trump go down in the annals of American history as one of the most racist presidents ever? What do you think? He certainly would face a substantial amount of competition on the racist front. There have been many frightfully racist U.S. presidents in American history, and here are 11 of them. Okay? Presidents in U.S. history that have been racist of all time. George Walker Bush, 43rd president, 2001-2009. Not only did President Bush No Child Left Behind Act 2003 increase the stranglehold of standardized testing on America's children, test and anti-racists have long argued were racist. The NCLBA, which is No Child Left Behind Act, more or less encouraged funding mechanisms that decreased or did not increase funding to schools with students were struggling or not making improvement on tests, thus privately leaving the neediest students of color behind. And then 2 years later, President Bush's Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is called FEMA, publicly left thousands of stranded black folk behind after Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29, 2005. While reporters quickly reached the Gulf Coast, federal officials made excuses for all their delays, quickening the death spiral in New Orleans. Ensuring that President Bush would land on this list on the most racist presidents of all time. And to top that off, President Bush's economic policies, his lax regulation of Wall Street loners and speculators, helped bring into being the Great Recession, what we know now, bringing about the largest loss of Black and Latino wealth in recent history. Number 10, John Calvin Coolidge, Jr. So let me say that, John Calvin Coolidge Jr. He's 30th president. This was during 1923 to 1929. So President Bush's FEMA response to Hurricane Katrina seemed prompt when compared to President Coolidge's handling of the Great Mississippi River flood in 1927. While most white communities were saved, riverside Black communities were flooded to reduce pressure on the levees. And then these thousands of displaced Blacks were forced to work for their rations under the gun of the National Guard and area planters, leading to a conflagration of mass beatings, lynchings, and rapes. Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, who President Coolidge eventually appointed to head the relief efforts, capitalized on Southern segregationist support for his flood mismanagement and succeeded Coolidge in the White House. President Coolidge also signed arguably the most racist, ethnocentric Immigration Act in history, an act championed by Republican eugenicist Democratic Klansmen. The Immigration Act of 1924 was co-authored by Washington Congressman Albert Johnson, well-schooled in theories of yellow peril that had rationalized discrimination against West Coast Asians for decades. The bipartisan measure further restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, severely restricted African immigrants, and banned immigration of Arabs and Asians. America's most and must be kept American. And so we've heard that slogan, Make America Great Again. Sounds similar, huh? America must be kept American. President Coolidge had said during his first annual message to Congress in 1923. So number 9 is Dwight David Eisenhower, 34th president, 1953 to 1961. Most presidents made this list for what they did. President Eisenhower made this list for what he did not do. He made a list as a representative of all the U.S. presidents who did nothing to stop the trepidations of slavery and segregation and mass incarceration. The NAACP lawyers persuaded the U.S. Supreme Court to rule Jim Crow as unconstitutional in 1954. President Eisenhower did not endorse Brown versus Board of Education and dragged his feet to enforce it. So, racism has gone far back, as some of us have not even been here, and it has been going on. And I'm adding that in there. So at a White House dinner the year before, President Eisenhower had told Chief Justice Earl Warren he could understand why white Southerners wanted to make sure their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside big black bucks. He reluctantly sent federal troops to protect the Little Rock Nine, who were desegregating in Arkansas high school. So he considered that act to be the most repugnant of all his presidential acts. During those critical years after the 1954 Brown decision, this former five-star World War general did not wage war against segregation. So sometimes, I'm adding this in here, by not doing anything about racism and seeing it happen and knowing it's happening and being complicit with it is just as bad as somebody doing things to perpetuate it. And so it goes on to say, and he remains as much to blame as anyone for its persistence for the lives lost fighting against it. Number 8, James Knox Polk, 11th president during the years of 1845 to 1849. In 1840s, Western expansion of the U.S. was uniting white Americans while the Western expansion of slavery was dividing white Americans. Months after President Polk took office, John O'Sullivan had imagined white Americans' manifest destiny. If anybody knows about that in history, that was a such thing, to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us. President Polk leaned on his racist idea when his administration waged the Mexican-American War. That was during the years of 1846 to 1848. The war propagandists framed the U.S. as bringing freedom and civilization to the backward Mexicans. So for those of you people that are experiencing things now and you're wondering why it's happening, this has been happening since before we were born. It's not uncommon for the U.S. to have a history that is ugly and smeared with nothing but people who have pretty much enacted racism on individuals that they deem as inferior to their particular race. And so the U.S. sees from that point on, from the war spoils, the U.S. sees Mexico nearly all of what it is now, American Southwest, a gargantuan land seizure that mirrored the ongoing violent seizures of Native American land and the ongoing violent seizures of black labor as well. So President Polk led the fight against the politicians and activists pressing to ban slavery in the new southwestern territories. This lifelong slaveholder was angrily hated by anti-slavery Americans as the leader of the Western marching slave power. Indeed, President Polk wanted slavery to extend to the Pacific Ocean. He looked away as white slaveholders and non-slaveholders danced around the legal protections for Mexican landowners inscribed in 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and went about illegally stealing the lands of the new group of Mexican-American citizens. So President Polk started a forgetful history of the Mexican Southwest and the long history of racism against Mexicans. Instead, what happened is inside and outside of the border, a history of racism that is now fueling the campaign of Donald Trump today. So number 7 is Thomas Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the U.S., between the years of 1913 and 1921, the same reason why anti-racist students have been pushing recently for Princeton University to take Wilson's name down from campus buildings are the same reasons why he made this list. President Wilson never turned his back on the racist ideas that he produced as Princeton political scientist. Okay? So President Wilson oversaw the resegregation of the federal government. Black federal workers were fired, and those that remained faced separate and unequal workspaces, lunchrooms, and bathrooms, and so on. So he refused to appoint black ambassadors to Haiti and the Democratic Republic, or Dominican Republic, that is. So as was custom, Professor Wilson and the President Wilson unapologetically backed what he called Great Ku Klux Klan and championed the Klan's violent disenfranchisement of the Southern African American in the late 19th century. So President Wilson began the brutal 2 decades. This was 2 decades that it went on in the U.S. of occupation of Haiti in 1915, preventing Haitians from self-governing, and possibly most egregiously at The Versailles Convention settling World War I in 1919. So President Wilson effectively killed Japan's proposal for the treaty recognizing racial equality, thus sustaining the life of European colonialism. Number 6 was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd president during the years of 1933 to 1945. Eleanor Roosevelt storied life of activity on the civil rights front could not save her husband from making this list. Neither could the storied life of the activity on the racist front of his uncle Theodore Roosevelt save him. FDR's racism was even more impactful than that of his uncle Teddy. President Roosevelt Executive Order 1942 that ended up rounding up and forcing more than 100,000 Japanese Americans into prisons during World War II is arguably the most racist executive order in American history. He thankfully spared German and Italian Americans from the military prisons, but that showed his racism even more so. And while some of the white American competitors in 1936 Berlin Olympics received invitations to the White House, Jesse Owens did not. President Roosevelt snubbed of the U.S. four-time gold medal winner came around the same time he was pushing through Congress all of the job benefits in the New Deal, like minimum wage, Social Security, unemployment insurance, and unionizing rights. Farmers and domestic Southern blacks' primary vacations were excluded from the New Deal, and the federal relief was locally administered, satisfying Southern segregationists. Northern segregationists were also satisfied by the housing discrimination in the New Deal initiatives, like coding black neighborhoods as unsuitable for the new mortgages. And we have heard about the illegal dealings that have happened in the home market in the U.S. that go back as far back as the early 1900s, maybe further back than that. And so, as such, black communities remain buried in the Great Depression long after the 1930s, while the New Deal remain policies combined with the GI Bill exploded the size of white middle class, which is why many people in the U.S. that are white, that have family that were successful during this time, was because of these New Deal policies and these laws that they put in act to make white wealth expand and black wealth decrease. So, number 5, Thomas Jefferson, the third president during 1801 to 1809. By the time President Jefferson took office in 1801, his "and all men created equal" slogan was fast becoming a distant memory in the new nation's racial politics. President Jefferson had emerged as the preeminent American authority on black inferiority, pretty much perpetuating those ideals that racist individuals have of blacks and their persona of them, to pretty much discredit them, not give them jobs, not give them housing, not look at them as worthy, not feel that they are have any importance whatsoever. His racist ideas, the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments, both of body and mind. So in his perennially best-selling Notes on the State of Virginia, 1787, this goes back, were the impactful. They were that impactful. And still, it's persistent today. We see what's going on with all the protests, all the violence, all the racial discord that is happening. So his notes were useful for powerful Americans rationalizing slavery after the American Revolution. In the book, Jefferson also offered the most popular race relation solution of the 19th century, the freeing and civilizing and the colonizing of all blacks back to barbaric Africa. Haven't we heard somebody say some similar things about African continents? President Jefferson should be applauded for pushing Congress to pass the Slave Trade Act in 1807. Okay. Then again, a new evil replaced the old. The measure closed the door on the nation's legal participation in the international slave trade in 1808. The flung open that door on the domestic slave trade. Large slaveholders like President Jefferson supported the law since it increased the demand and the value of their captives. They started deliberately breeding enslaved Africans to supply and demand of planter rushing into the Louisiana Territory, which President Jefferson purchased from Napoleon in 1803. So I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. Jefferson explained to a friend June 30th, 1820. Number 4, James Monroe, 5th president, 1817 to 1825. If Jefferson was the brainchild of the colonization movement, the President Monroe was the pioneering initiator. Weeks before he was elected candidate, Monroe watched and supported the formation of the American Colonization Society. So presiding over the first meeting, House Speaker Henry Clay tasked the organization with ridding our country of a useless and pernicious, if not dangerous, population of redeeming Africa from ignorance and barbarism. So by 1821, President Monroe had seized a strip of coastal West African land. This first American colony of Africa was later named Liberia, and its capital was named Monrovia. But it was another namesake that really thrust President Monroe onto this list in particular. We declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. Thus, said President Monroe during his 7th annual message to Congress in 1923, several U.S. presidents used this Monroe Doctrine as a rationalizing chord for U.S. intervention into sovereign Latin American states, including the toppling of the government unfriendly to U.S. interests. The Monroe Doctrine was a racist and devastating to Latin American communities abroad, as the doctrine of manifest destiny was to indigenous communities at home. So in 2013, President Obama's Secretary of State John Kerry declared to Organization of American States, the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. Number 3, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th President, 1981 to 1989. The arbiter of the welfare queen myth, who evoked the old slaveholder segregationist mantra of states' rights, perfected President Richard Nixon's infamous Southern strategy that actually worked nationally. President Ronald Reagan attracted voters through racially coded appeals that allowed them to avoid admitting that they were attracted by racist appeals. He stood at the head of the reactionary movement that undid some of the material gains of civil rights and Black Power activists. During President Reagan's first year in office, the median income of Black families declined by 5.2%, and the number of poor Americans and poor Americans alike and African Americans who were disproportionately black increased by 2.2 million, a sign of things to come under Reaganomics. Then in 1982, President Reagan announced his war on drugs. Or was it a war on drugs? And in auspicious time when drug use was declining, we must mobilize all of our forces to stop the flow of drugs in this country, Reagan said. President Reagan surely did not mobilize any of his forces to stop the CIA-backed Contra rebels in Nicaragua from smuggling cocaine into the country to fund their operations, but he surely did mobilize his forces to draw media attention to their spreading of crack cocaine in 1985. The media blitz handed his slumbering war on drugs an intense media high in 1986. I lived through that. I remember all of that. All those commercials, this is your brain on drugs, the war on drugs, Reaganomics, the trickle-down effect. What trickled down is mass incarceration. I'm adding that in there. And most of the people being black. And high poverty. So that fall, he signed with great pleasure the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established minimum sentencing for drug crimes and led to mass incarceration. And I'm saying this I said it before I even read it, of black and brown drug offenders over the next few decades. Like his campaign strategies, President Reagan took President Nixon's racist drug war to the whole new level. And the mass incarceration of black and brown bodies accelerated under Bush times 2, and Clinton administrations, especially after Clinton's 1994 crime bill. White drug offenders consuming and dealing drugs at the similar or greater rates remain disproportionately free. Reagan stands on this list as the representative of all of these mass incarcerating presidents in the late 20th century. Number 2, Andrew Jackson, the 7th president during the years of 1829 to 1837. Yes, the president of the U.S. Treasury is planning on putting on the back of Harriet Tubman, is the second most racist president of all time. Ironically, he attracted the same demographic groups, less educated, less affluent white men, that Trump is attracting these days. So Jackson stepped into the U.S. presidency as a wealthy Tennessee enslaver and military general who had founded and spearheaded the Democratic Party. Jacksonian Democrats and historians call them, amassed a winning coalition of Southern enslavers, white working people, and recent European immigrants who regularly rioted against abolitionists, indigenous and black communities, indigenous and black communities. So the civil rights activists before and after the Civil War. So when the mass mailings of anti-slavery tracts captured national attention in 1835, President Jackson called on Congress to pass a law prohibiting, under severe penalties, the circulation of incendiary publications. So the following year, Jackson and his supporters instituted the infamous gag rule, is what they called it, that effectively tabled all the anti-slavery petitions rushing into Congress. So, and yet it was his Indian removal policies that were the most devastating of all of the lives of Native Americans and African Americans as well. So it wasn't just one group targeted. So, beginning the Indian Removal Act in 1830, President Jackson forced several Native American nations to relocate from their ancestral homelands in the southern of the United States to areas of Mississippi River, and all to make way for those enslaved Africans being forcibly hauled into the Deep South. President Jackson helped forge this trail of Native American tears out of a Deep South, and this trail of African tears into the Deep South. Number 1, Andrew Johnson, 17th president during the years of 1865 to 1869. This Democrat from Tennessee was sworn into presidency after John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln days after the Civil War had ended, and the President Johnson issued the Reconstitution proclamations about a month later in May 29, 1865, and he deflated the high hopes of civil rights activists. President Johnson offered amnesty, property rights, voting rights to all but the highest Confederate officials, most of whom he pardoned a year later. He later ordered the return of the land pardoned Confederates, null and voided those wartime orders that granted blacks 40 acres and a mule and removed many of the black troops from the South. Feeling empowered, the President Johnson Confederates instituted a series of discriminatory black codes at the constitutional conventions that reformulated Southern states in the summer and the fall of 1865. The immediate post-war South became the spitting image of the pre-war South in everything but name, as the law replaced the master. These racist policies caused a post-war war since an untold number of black people lost their lives resisting them. Congress stepped up to unravel and re-emerge of the Southern Confederacy in everything but name, but President Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and Civil Rights Bill of 1866, compelling Congress to pass them over his veto. President Johnson also opposed 14th and 15th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution in 1868, became the first American president to be impeached by the House of Representatives. He remained in office after being acquitted in the Senate by one vote, but President Johnson has never been acquitted in the annals of history. So he still makes those lists on the worst presidents of all time, and he tops this list as the most racist president of all time. Do you think he's the most racist, or most of these presidents are just racist, period? Now, that is what this article is pointing out. If we delve deeper into this, what has recently surfaced all over social media is Ronald Reagan. Reagan's long hidden history of racist conversation that had surfaced with Richard Nixon. In newly unearthed audio, then California governor disparaged African delegates to the United States. This is by Atem Naftali, and so you see them pictured here. All of these things supposedly were hidden, or either they were kept closed off from the public and from people realizing that the U.S. and America has deeply been rooted in corruption and racism long before some of us were even born. So the day after the United Nations voted to recognize the People's Republic of China, then California Governor Ronald Reagan phoned President Richard Nixon. He phoned him at the White House and vented his frustration at the delegates who had sided against the U.S. Last night, I tell you to watch the thing on television as I did, Reagan says. Yeah, Nixon interjected. Reagan forged ahead with his complaint. To see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes. Nixon gave a huge laugh. You don't believe it?
And last night I tell you, to watch that television, I did. Those monkeys from those African countries, and they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes. Well, and then the tail wags the dog there, isn't it? Yeah. The tail wags the dog.
And so, these things have surfaced for a reason. It's what most people who are really in tune with what has been going on have always known, that most of these presidents that have been in our midst, these politicians and these individuals that were doing these different policies, have been racial or racist. So the past months has brought presidential racism back into the headlines. This October of 1971 exchange between current and future presidents is a reminder that other presidents have subscribed to the racist belief that Africans and African Americans are somehow inferior. The most novel aspect of President Donald Trump's racist gibes isn't that he said them, but that he said them in public. So the exchange was taped by Nixon and then later became responsibility of the Nixon Presidential Library, which I directed from, which I believe 2007 to 2011. So when the National Archives originally released this tape of the conversation in 2000s, the racist portion was apparently withheld to protect Reagan's privacy. So a court order stipulated that the tapes be reviewed chronologically, and chronologically review was completed in 2013. So not until 2017 or 2018 did the National Archives begin to general re-reviewing of the earliest Nixon tapes. So Reagan's death in 2004 eliminated the privacy concerns. So last year, a researcher, I requested that conversations involving Ronald Reagan be re-reviewed. And 2 weeks ago, the National Archives released complete versions of the October 1971 conversations involving Reagan online. And so when the UN took its vote to seat a delegation from Beijing instead of from Taiwan in 1971, the members of the Tanzania delegation started dancing in the General Assembly, and Reagan, a devoted defender of Taiwan, was incensed and tried to reach Nixon that night for the vote. So Reagan despised the United Nations, which he described as a kangaroo court filled with bums, and he wanted the U.S. to withdraw from full participation immediately. And so Nixon was asleep when Reagan called, so they spoke the next morning. So Reagan's slur touched an already raw nerve. Earlier that day, Nixon had called his deputy National Security Advisor, Al Haig, to cancel any future meetings with any African leaders who had not voted with the United States on Taiwan, even if they had already been scheduled. So don't even submit to me the problem that it's difficult to turn it off since we have already accepted it, Nixon exclaimed. So just turn it off on the ground that I will be out of town. So Nixon's anger in the UN delegation from African nations for the loss was misplaced. So his own State Department blamed factors other than African voting, including maneuvering by the British and French behind the scene for the loss, but Nixon would have none of it. The Africans were to blame. So had the story stopped there, it would have been bad enough. Racist venting is still racist, but What happened next showed the dynamic power of racism when it finds enablers. So Nixon used Reagan's call as an excuse to adapt the language to make the same point to many others. Right after hanging up with Reagan, Nixon sought out Secretary of State William Rogers. Even though Reagan had called Nixon to press him with withdrawal from the United Nations, the Nixon's telling Reagan complaints about Africans became primary purpose of the call. So as you can imagine, Nixon confided in Rogers. Their strong feeling that we just shouldn't, as Reagan said, he saw these. As he said, he saw these. Nixon stammered, choosing his words carefully. These cannibals on television last night, he says. Christ, they weren't even wearing shoes. And here the United States is going to submit its fate to that, and so forth and so on. So the president wanted his patrician Secretary of State to understand that Reagan spoke for racist Americans and that they needed to be listened to. And but that's typical of a reaction, which is probably, that's right, Rogers interjected quite strong. And so basically these were tapes and things that were leaked out of conversations that took place back in that time.
I, for example, just had a call from Reagan, California, and he's been out there and so forth, and you can imagine there's strong feeling that we just shouldn't. He said these cannibals on television last night, and he explained, he said they were even wearing shoes, and he says here the United States is going to submit its fate to that, and so forth and so on. And that's typical of a reaction, which is probably quite strong.
And so Nixon couldn't stop retelling the version of Reagan what he said. Oddly unfocused, he spoke with Rogers again 2 hours later and repeated the story as if it would be a new story to the secretary. So Reagan called me last night, Nixon said, and I didn't talk to him until this morning, but he is, of course, outraged. And I found out what outraged him, and I found that this is a typical of a lot of people. They saw it on television, and he said, these cannibals jumping up and down and all that. And apparently it was a pretty grotesque picture, like Rogers had not seen the television images, but Rogers agreed. Apparently it was a terrible scene, Nixon added, and they cheered. And so Nixon said that he practically got sick to his stomach, and that's why he called. And he said it was a terrible scene, and that sort of thing will have an emotional effect on people. As Reagan said, this bunch of people who don't even wear shoes yet to be kicking the United States in the teeth. It was a terrible thing, they thought. Nixon didn't think of himself as a racist. Perhaps that's why it was so important to him to keep quoting Reagan's racism rather than his own and the own sentiment of himself. But Reagan's comments about African leaders resonated with Nixon because it reflected his warped thinking about African Americans. Sounds familiar. What goes on today and what has been going on even after their presidency. So in the fall of 1971, the Nixon administration was engaged in a massive welfare reform effort and was also facing school busing during that time. So these two issues apparently inspired Nixon to examine more deeply his own thinking on whether African Americans could make it in American society. Only 3 weeks before the call with Reagan, Nixon had revealed his opinions on Africans in a conversation with the Harvard professor Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And if those of you don't know who Moynihan is, He had briefly served in the Nixon administration, so Nixon was attracted to the theories of Richard Herrnstein and Arthur Jensen, which linked IQ to race. Wondered with Moynihan's thought. I reluctantly concluded, based at least on the evidence persistently before me, that what Herrnstein says and what was said earlier by Jensen is probably very close to the truth, Nixon explained to a quiet Moynihan. Nixon believed in a hierarchy of races, with whites and Asians being much higher up than people that were African descent and Latino descent, or Latinos, period, and Africans, period. And he had convinced himself that it wasn't racist to think black people as the group were inferior to whites, so long as he held them in a paternalistic regard. So within groups, there were geniuses, Nixon said, and there are geniuses within black groups. There are more within Asian groups. And this is knowledge that is better not to know. Okay? So there are only certain people, he believed, that had higher qualities. These presidents had a lot of racial views. So Nixon's analysis of African leadership reflected the prejudice towards American black citizens, and this is at least what he had told Moynihan. And Moynihan, he wrote many scathing reviews of how he viewed races of people and black people and welfare, what he claimed to be black women who were going to be fatherless and who were going to have races of children that were worthless. He wrote those things. I've seen his writings, extremely racist. And so having that in mind in one fact, did you realize there is not, of the 40 or the 45, you're in the United Nations, black countries are represented there, not one of a president or prime minister who is there as a result of the contested election, such as were insisting upon in Vietnam. So, and he continued a little later in the conversation, I'm not saying that blacks cannot govern, I am saying that they have a hell of a time. And now that must demonstrate something. So 50 years later, the one fact that we should have in mind is that our nation's chief executives assumed that non-white citizens of the U.S. were somehow inferior to those that were white. Of course, Nixon confided in Moynihan, who had been one of the House intellectuals, about the nature of his interest in the research of African American intelligence. So the reason I have to know is that as I go for programs, I must know that they have basic weaknesses. And so as these and other tapes make clear, the 37th President of the United States was a racist. And that was Ronald Reagan. He believed that treating people according to their race and the race implied fundamental differences in the individual human beings. Nixon's racism matters to us because he allowed his views on race to shape the U.S. policies. Some of the things that we're going through right now have been going on for decades and decades. And I'm adding that in there because it is true. Both foreign and domestic, his policies need to be viewed through that lens. So the 40th president was not left as a record of his private thoughts. Reagan's racism appears to be documented only once on the Nixon tapes and never in his own diaries. His comment on African leaders or African American leaders or African people, however, sheds new light on what lay behind the governor's passionate defense of apartheid states of Rhodesia and South Africa. Later in the 1970s, during the 1976 primary challenge run against General Ford, Reagan publicly opposed the Ford's administration rejection of white minority rule in Rhodesia, and we seem to be embarking on a policy of dictating to people of the Southern Africa and running the risk of increased violence and bloodshed, Reagan said at the rally in Texas. So these new tapes are a stark reminder of the racism that often lay behind the public rhetoric of American presidents. So as I write biography to JFK, I found that this sort of racism did not animate President Kennedy. Indeed, early on, he took political risks to help African leaders, notably Gamal Abdel Nasser and Kwame Nkrumah, but his reluctance to do more sooner for African Americans cannot be separated from the paternalism that he brought on the Oval Office or the prejudice held by the parts of the Boston inner circle. So Kennedy at least learned on the job that securing civil rights for all was moral imperative. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is a symptom of a sickness that dwells in American society, sometimes deeply and weakly, sometimes on the surface and feverishly. So what's going on right now? He bears responsibility for his own actions, but the tropes that we hear, the turns of the phrase, the clumsy indirection, and the worst and the gunk about American society that he and his most devoted followers pass off as ideas, have an ugly tradition. A historical tradition, I might add. It is not at the core of American tradition, for what makes us mighty and successful is that we are much more than the narrowest of our minds, but it remains an ineluctable part of American culture nonetheless. So Nixon never changed his mind about supposed inherent inferiority of Africans. And at the end of October 1971, he discussed the UN vote with the best friend, Baby Rebozo. Baby delighted Nixon by echoing Reagan. And that reaction on television was, it proves how they ought to be still hanging from trees by their tails, Nixon laughed. Oh, you don't believe that?
What do you want to do down there?
Well, everybody feels the same way. The hell with all these little stinking nations that we're supporting.
I don't think they very much do it.
But of course, and then the reaction, I think you're absolutely right, that reaction on television proves how they ought to be still hanging from the trees by the tails. Really.
Okay.
All right, I look forward to seeing you. All right.
These days, though, Trump's imaginary or imagery that we see on television is less zoological, but it is pretty much the same tropes we're hearing in spirit. And this president, unlike Nixon, doesn't believe he needs to hide behind anyone else's racism. This article was out of the Atlantic by Tim Naftali, who is a clinical associate professor in the history of New York University, and he is the first director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Thanks for listening.